This is lesson 1 of the Brandenburg Concerto No.5, the third movement by Johann Sebastian Bach, taken from the GCSE EdXL set works for music. In this lesson, we're going to look a little bit at the background of Bach and his Brandenburg Concerto, understand what a concerto grosso is and the instrumentation of the Brandenburg Concerto, understand what is meant by concertino and ripieno, and then look at a little bit about ornamentation and dynamics, just to recap, because we've looked at those in the previous set work. So a bit of a background. Johann Sebastian Bach was one of the greatest composers and most important figures in all of musical history. He was born in Germany in 1685 to a family of professional musicians and was the youngest of 8 children. Fortunately, though, he was made an orphan by the age of 10 years old. Now, if you look at the top, you'll see the sort of history of classical music. In 1450, we start with the Renaissance period, and then in 1600, we move to Baroque, and Bach was born 85 years into the Baroque period. Previously, you studied Purcell, who was also a musician during the Baroque period of time. You've listened to his music for a while. There was kind of a 10-year crossover period where Purcell died 10 years after Bach was born. Now, in the 18th century, to make a living as a composer, you almost had to be a servant. You would have a patron who would employ you, and they'd employ you the same way they would employ any other servant. And Bach was appointed choirmaster of the court of Prince Leopold. Now, just before getting this job, just before Prince Leopold became his patron, Bach was commissioned by the Margrave, who was a type of nobleman in Brandenburg, to compose a set of instrumental pieces. Now, if you think that we are studying these pieces now, 400 years later, almost 350 years later, they're played constantly on the radio. Their music is used in other, films, etc., etc. Bach was never actually paid for creating these 6 concertos, never received any money for creating them. But let's have a look a bit more at it. So what is a concerto grosso? So a concerto grosso is a piece that features a soloist and an orchestra. So you might have a flautist, a flute player, as the soloist, and they would be accompanied by the entire orchestra. But the main focus of that piece is the flautist. If there is only one soloist, it is called a solo concerto. If there is a group of solo instruments, so a flautist, a flute player, a violinist, and another instrument, then it's a concerto grosso, grosso standing for bigger. Now, concertos tend to have 3 movements, large sections of pieces separated by short breaks, and each movement has a contrasting mood and tempo. Now, Brandenburg No.5 follows the typical order of the 3 movements. You have a fast section to start off with, fast movement, then move to a slower movement, and then back to a faster movement. The 3 solo instruments are known as the concertino, and the small string orchestra as the ripieno. So you've got your concertino, which is the 3 solo instruments that are being accompanied by a small string orchestra, which is called the ripieno. The 3 solo instruments in the Brandenburg Concerto are the flute, the violin, and the harpsichord. Remember, harpsichord used in Baroque period because the piano has yet to be invented. You've heard harpsichord before playing the ground bass in Music for a While. As in Music for a While, there is a basso continuo, a continuous bass line played throughout, made up by a cello and a harpsichord reading from a figured bass. So we're seeing crossovers between 2 different styles of music here. Although they're both from the same period, Music for a While being a vocal piece and Brandenburg Concerto being an instrumental piece. The harpsichord takes on a dual role in this piece though, whereas in Music for a While the harpsichord is purely there as an accompaniment. The harpsichord takes on a solo role as well as playing the basso continuo. So let's have a look at the layout of Brandenburg Concerto. There are groups of solo instruments, as we said. The concertino up here, which is the flute, the harpsichord and the violin. You've got your orchestra, which is the ripieno, a small string orchestra, one violin rather than the usual two. There's only really one violin, a viola, a cello, and then something called a violone, which is a double bass, big double bass instrument. This is an old version of the double bass before it became the double bass that we know now. And the harpsichord taking on the dual role, as we said, it plays as a soloist and then as the basso continuo, and is joined with the cello on the basso continuo. And then we have our movements. So the first movement, I'm going to have to move this again. The first movement being fast in D major, and you have the concertino and the ripieno playing together. The second movement, it becomes a slow movement, and we move to B minor. Now, you'll see if you've got your circle of fifths that B minor becomes the relative minor of D major, and you only get the concertino. So only the solo instruments are playing at this point. And then you move to the third movement, which again returns to fast, and as you can see, it returns to D major, and then returns to the concertino and ripieno playing together at the same time. The third movement of the Concerto Grosso, so this movement here, is your set work. So we're not looking at the first movement, we're not looking at the second movement, we are purely looking at the third movement. It is a gig, which is a fast and lively kind of dance. So it's technically a dance piece. I have to move me again. There are many features typical of Baroque period which can be heard in the movement. We are going to look at these in more detail over the coming lessons, but for the moment, go and have a listen to it. Go and see if you can hear the music, these features being played, and see if you can follow the score. So there's a copy of the score on the website as well, which would be good for you to look at. So here's the different things. You've got the ornamentation, which is the notes that decorate the melody. I'm just going to press that and get rid of this little thing down here. I'm not sure why that's there. There we go. So the ornamentation, which is notes that decorate a melody. You've got changes to texture. So we've got monophonic, canon, unison, contrapuntal if you're unsure what they are. Have a look at them, work them out, Google them if you have to. Antiphonal, so texture swapping between two groups. So your groups are your concertino and the ripieno. Sequences, so repetition of melody at a higher or lower pitch. We've seen that in every set work has sequence in it. But if you think of the ground bass in music for a while, you have your dum 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 dum, and that repeats, and that's a sequence. So that pattern repeats again at higher or lower pitch. Pedal notes. We've seen a pedal note in Star Wars, a sustained repeated note, usually in the bass. We know in Star Wars it's an inverted pedal note because it's played in the treble. Suspensions, we've looked at those with chords. Diatonic, melodies and chords that only use the notes of the key. A fugue. Terrace dynamics, so contrasting dynamics of two levels, because you didn't really get much dynamic variety in Baroque period. You only really had those two levels, really, really loud or really, really quiet. Basso continuo, which we've known, and a figured bass, which you'll have seen on Music for a While, and we spent some time trying to work it out. If you're unsure, go back and have a look at Music for a While and see how to work out a figured bass. So ornamentation. Ornamentation is a key feature of the Baroque period. You will hear the same use of melodic decoration in Purcell's Music for a While. If you again go back to Music for a While, look at the list of ornamentations that are used, try and work them out. Players would improvise their own ornaments on the spot, particularly when the music was repeated. And there are two ornaments notated by Bach. So he actually specifically told them to use a trill, which alternates very quickly between two notes. Now the harpsichordist often plays a trill when it has a longer minim note. So when it's got a longer note, it will flick between that note and the note above really, really quickly. And it's because, unlike the other instruments, the harpsichord can't sustain its sound. So if you think of a piano now, you press the sustain pedal and that note stays, and it's a long note. Harpsichord could not do this. So in order to keep the note alive, the harpsichordist would do a trill. The other written ornamentation in Brandenburg Concerto is an appoggiatura, an expressive melodic device that leans on to the main note that follows. I'll move that up there so you can have a look. So that there is what it looks like. Fortunately, I don't have access to a piano just yet, but that's what it would sound like. So although it's written as a minim with a little grace note there, it sounds like two notes being played, like two crotchet notes being played. As for dynamics, now composers would rarely write down dynamics during the Baroque period of time, mainly because, again, as I said, they didn't really use dynamics very often. And the contrast in volume and dynamics relied more on the amount of instruments that are playing, so the texture, rather than that instrument's ability to play loudly or quietly. And it occurs in this piece where the music shifts from the small concertino of 3 solo instruments to a larger ripieno orchestra. It gives a clear contrast between loud and soft, which is called terraced dynamics. So either loud or soft, there's no in between. There's no use of crescendos or diminuendos, which we can hear, which is gradually getting soft or gradually getting loud. It was one extreme to another. As for tempo, the speed of the music, is indicated by the Italian word allegro, which means fast and lively. The time signature is 2/4, so we looked at 4/4, we've looked at 12/8, 6/8, and this is 2/4, which means that the beats are often divided into triplets. So instead of 1, 2, you'd have triplets: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And in Bach's day, a triplet always had to have 3 notes. When a long, short pattern of notes was wanted, it was written like this. Later, it would have been written like this. Today, we might write the whole movement in what we call a compound meter of 6/8. The opening subject would look like this and sound exactly the same as how Bach wrote it, but he wrote it in 2/4. If you can try it, have a go at it, see what the difference is and see if it works. So that's the end of lesson 1. Go back and write whatever you need to, listen to whatever you need to, have a go at the review questions, and then go and make any notes that you need to from the website. Just on a quick one, if you go through the website and you look at any of the key words that are highlighted here, they will take you to a definition or an example of what that sounds like, so you can go through there. Lesson 2 will be based on key features of the Brandenburg Concerto. So get your notes done, get your revision done. We'll see you next time.